Good evening, and welcome to this special broadcast. My name is Richard Verber, and I am the Communications Director at the United Synagogue. Tonight we're going to be exploring coronavirus and what. Coronavirus has brought the world almost to a standstill. Businesses have been decimated, economies stand on the brink. For our young people, this is a particularly anxious time. Schools are closed, A-levels and GCSEs have been cancelled. The same can be said for our older and vulnerable members of the community. The lockdown, intended to protect the most vulnerable and stop the disease from spreading, has left thousands of people with a deep sense of mental anguish. But of course, the biggest toll is the human one. And whilst data around the world varies, 180,000 people have already lost their lives, 18,000 of which are here in the UK. Our small Jewish community is not unaffected. More than 300 souls have been taken before their time. So where is God in this crisis? What is the Jewish response to it? To help us explore this challenging subject, I'm delighted to be joined by the broadcaster and writer, Rabbi Yitzchak, Senior Rabbi of the United Synagogue. Rabbi Schochet will be well known to many of us, not only from his years in the rabbinate, but also his popular weekly Ask the Rabbi column in the Jewish newspapers. And indeed, Rabbi Schochet will answer your questions following our conversation. Please do drop us a line in the comments, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Rabbi Schochet, good evening.
Good evening to you, Richard. Good to be joined with you.
Thank you. Let me begin then, of course, by being polite. Tell me, Rabbi, how are you? How are your family? How are you finding lockdown?
How am I? I am personally, thank God, physically well. I've always maintained an exercise regime with a personal trainer for a good number of years. Now, of course, I do it virtually and got my family into it as well. It is now more vital than ever for one's actual sanity. And as far as my family are concerned, thank God, they're all doing okay as well. Thank God.
Good. No, I'm really pleased to hear. Thank you very much for joining us. Tell me, Rabbi, how has this crisis impacted your community?
That's an interesting question. These past weeks or months have been nothing if not overwhelming. That's why I stressed in the first instance when I said I am physically, thank God, well. The impact in particular on the Mill Hill community has actually been, sadly, quite considerable. In the first few weeks that the virus hit, email notifications about bereavements were coming out of the office thick and fast. I mean, we lost some 9 members in a very short span of time, many of them active members, comparatively young. In addition, there are relatives, that is to say parents or siblings of members. And in a span of 2 weeks, we're talking something like some 20 bereavements. And then there are the others who are still sadly critically ill in hospital. And the community was reeling, the community still is reeling. Personally, of course, I have to be there for every single one of those families, in itself so much more difficult in the virtual world. And since you're asking, I'm going to wear my heart on my sleeve, which I normally never do. I don't cry. The last time I cried was when my father passed away 6 years ago. But there was one day the other week, I had 4 levayas in one day. I knew every one of them personally. And after the last one, I just went back into my car, still in the Bushy Cemetery car park, and I cried. So in short, I am, thank God, physically well, but it has been overwhelming in the community.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I can only begin to imagine how challenging this must be for you. What have you said to your community this time? How have you kept them together?
There are a range of obviously different means by which one can keep the community together. In fact, we're interacting on an almost daily basis. Not on an almost, in fact, on a daily basis. Every single morning, we have not 1, but 2 shacharit services, because even in lockdown and in a virtual world, everybody needs to have a shul that they don't go to. But really, in seriousness, it's paralleling the services that we otherwise had when we were at shul. So there are 2 morning services. There were a whole range of daily lessons that are being taught and other means by which we are continuously engaged in the community, and particularly a sermon that gets sent out each week with an email, and Kabbalat Shabbat, when everybody joins together. We have some 100 or so on Zoom, and that again provides opportunity for me to speak to the community and to address them as I did each week, dealing very much and going to the very heart of what I know they're all feeling. In one particular instance, a couple of weeks ago, I told my community that rather than having a conversation with you as I'm doing each week as part of the Kabbalat Shabbat, I'm going to have a conversation with God. And if you want, you can all go ahead and listen in. And then I proceeded to talk to God, as it were, in front of 120 people watching on Zoom about what was going on.
I just want to say I've been told a little bit of sound trouble possibly at my end. I believe it's now been fixed. Apologies to people joining us who didn't either hear the introduction or my question, but it sounds like the line is now much better. My apologies to that for people watching. Rabbi Schochet, you've introduced God, and that is where this conversation is going. You said you're talking to God. What on earth are you saying at this time?
You're asking me where, well, I guess that's the question, the title of what we're talking about tonight. Where is God in COVID-19? There seems to be something that we all agree on. Human life has value, that not only do we exist, but that we should exist. And when something suddenly threatens that existence or pains that existence, or God forbid, indeed terminates that existence, then that strikes something deep at the core, and it raises all kinds of questions. I mean, why? If we are merely a random quirk, if we're just accidents, if we're just something that happened to evolve, why do we really care if something that came about by accident suddenly ends by accident? The point is that you cannot really talk about the issue of human suffering without taking God into consideration. If you deny the reality of God's existence, then there are no questions to begin with. Then Darwin's theory proves correct, survival of the fittest. This happened to you, that's just the way it is. Elie Wiesel, who endured the depths of hell in the pits of Auschwitz, summed it up thus. He said, you can either love God or you can hate God, but you can't ignore God. By definition, if you use the concept of human suffering to deny the existence of God, it's a logical absurdity. It's like saying, I can't understand Einstein's theory of relativity, therefore it must be flawed. It doesn't exist. I mean, that doesn't follow logically. That my inability to comprehend means that it's all wrong. So I can be upset, I can be frustrated, but I can't deny the reality. That would be an emotional response, not an intellectual response. Hence, you can love God, you can accept perspective, or you can be angry with him, yes, frustrated as to why, but logically, rationally, intellectually, whatever brought you into the belief and acceptance of God in the first instance, whatever prompted you and motivated you up until this point to embrace God's reality, cannot be rejected outright in the face of whatever adversity, just because now I don't get it. Now, some will argue that just proves that religion is opium for the masses. It's a crutch to lean on. To me, it says one thing. It's only when you accept the fact that things happen for a reason that you can then start entertaining the question of why. So where is God in all of this? Well, when Moses first encountered God at the burning bush, he said to God, dear God, what is your name? And in looking to identify God, I think Moses was really looking to understand the intricacies of divine interaction in this world. In his case, why are the Israelites suffering so much in Egypt? In our case, why is there vast suffering with this terrible virus in our world? And God's reply to Moses is as enigmatic as it is simple. He said, I shall be as I shall be, not as the popular misconception of I am what I am. God is telling Moses that despite your greatness, you remain a finite being confined to the limitations of time and space, and therefore cannot hope to understand the mechanisms of an infinite being. In this first ever divine communication by God through Moses to the Jewish people, he's effectively saying, if I am to be a part of your lives, then know that you can't always understand me. My thoughts are not your thoughts. You know, if you lived in a jungle all of your life, and then one day you stepped out and walked into an operating theater and you saw surgeons conducting surgery, you would cry blue murder. You'd think they're all a bunch of barbarians. Only, of course, they're not. What they're doing is just utterly alien to your primitive mind. Everything ultimately is happening for a reason, albeit we have to accept that it's one that is beyond human comprehension. And in this, I would say something else. I love always the anecdote about the farmer who had a horse that ran away, and all the people came to congratulate him I beg your pardon, all the people came to console him. And he said, I don't know, maybe it's a bad thing, maybe it's a good thing. Then his horse came back with a bunch of wild horses in tow, and all the people came to congratulate him. And he said, I don't know, maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. One day his son went riding out on one of those wild horses and fell off and broke his leg, and people came along and said, oh, we're so sorry. He said, I don't know, maybe it's a bad thing, maybe it's a good thing. And then the king decided to conscript all young, able-bodied men into the military. Only the farmer's son couldn't go because of his broken leg. The farmer said, now I know that when my horse ran away, it was a good thing. The point being that life is a series of events, and until we've reached the end of the series, it's hard to know exactly why things are happening. Sometimes you'll see it here, other times, in fact, most often, you will not see it until the hereafter. If in the process you can still love God, then hey, all the power to you. If you get angry with him, he gets it, he understands, he brought it to you in the first instance, but you can't ignore God. As in the words of the famous Kaddish Rabbi, a God that I can understand is not a God worth believing in. And I've met many a Holocaust survivor, and this is something I did share with my community recently, including my own grandparents. Incredible, inspiring, resilient. This is our personal 21st century challenge, undeniably so. And I simply look to them for encouragement, knowing that if they were able to rise to the challenge, go on and build again for the future, I need to dig deep, summon that faith that lies at the core of every single one of us, and go on to do the same. And I'll only add this. It doesn't mean we have to look to justify God's actions. Moses cried out to God as well and said, why do you allow evil to befall these people in Egypt as they were being challenged? We're entitled to do the same. We're entitled to be upset. We're entitled to challenge God. Why are you allowing this to happen? And that's not questioning God. That's about challenging God, which stems from the deepest reservoirs of human faith. Again, because only when you believe in God can you rage against something, knowing that this isn't just merely bad luck. And also that means that you also believe that God obviously is involved in all the intricate detail of everything that happens. So something could have stopped this. And that something clearly isn't yet stopping this. But I believe in God. I know he's concerned. I know he cares. I know he's involved at every level. Moses teaches us that we should speak to God. We should confront him. We should ask him. We should challenge him. We should remember we don't know enough to comprehend the answer. We must, however, believe and care enough to still always ask the questions.
Thank you for your very thorough answer. Do you think it makes a difference? Clearly, in some sense, it must do, that you are the rabbi in this. You can take a step back and perhaps take a deeper view, a more theological view. Would an answer like that provide comfort to somebody who really just feels that rage that you mentioned against God?
At the end of the day, you can always take people through an intellectual exercise, and that will always provide limited solace. But through someone who's actually enduring the pain, someone who endured the loss of a loved one, for as long as they're undergoing the emotion, the rabbis join us in the mission of ethics of the fathers. Don't ever try to console somebody when their deceased is lying in front of them. In other words, by definition, when they are in the throes of the pain, they are not susceptible to hearing any kind of rational argument. No, at that point, there's nothing one can do other than just simply give them a hug, which again, tragically at the moment, we simply can't do, and just show them that you care, that you love them, that they are not alone. It's interesting, when we greet a mourner, we say the Almighty should comfort you amongst all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Why on earth do we make reference to Zion and Jerusalem? Because when Jerusalem was destroyed, when the temple was destroyed, it wasn't personal to any one individual. It was something that affected the totality of the Jewish people. And we're telling each individual who is enduring pain and loss, you're not in this alone. We feel your pain and we're here in this with you.
Let me push you a bit further. I suppose if someone is really hugging and wrestling with God, could you sympathize if they said, it's now become too much for me, Rabbi? I am starting to question my belief, my Judaism. You've touched on the Odyssey or the nature of evil. an all-loving God just couldn't possibly do this to me, to my family, to the wider world?
Again, in the moment and in the throes of their pain, I will fully sympathize with them. And sometimes all you can, I'm not there as a rabbi in the first instance when someone is in the throes of pain to offer them theological solace. I'm only there to offer them practical, emotional love and comfort, whichever way I can best do so. And yes, in one conversation with a particular now unfortunate widow, she said to me, Rabbi, in due course, I want to be able to sit down and have a conversation with you. And I said, by all means, whenever you're ready. Until that point, I just call her every few days and we just talk and we reminisce about her beautiful husband. And we share memories that I might have of him over the last 25 years in Melville, that she has of him and has heard from other people, etc. So yeah, I fully sympathize and even maybe empathize to an extent those who are enduring personal pain. And I don't go anywhere near the theology in that moment in time. If we're asking a broader question for anybody else out there who hasn't been through the pain, if God can allow for this to happen, as one person said, we're skipping Pesach, that kind of, that doesn't necessarily wash with you. If it's hit you personally, I'm never the one to judge you by any means. But somebody who's just generally reflecting on what's going on out there and, dare I use the expression, maybe using it as an excuse to now suddenly reject God, whom they otherwise previously might have accepted in their life, well, okay, let's have the conversation. I actually refer to one point
to someone.
The last portion. Aaron endured the untimely passing of his two sons. And the Torah says he remained quiet. He didn't talk, he didn't respond, he didn't start offering all kinds of rationale, he didn't start talking theology. He literally just stayed quiet, consumed with the incredible grief of having lost his actual two sons. And the other reference I always have, and I always like to look to, is Abraham. Abraham lost his wife. The Torah makes a deliberate point of telling us that he cried. It's the first time you find an outpouring of emotion in the Torah. Why does Abraham cry? This is Abraham, the superhero, the man who was willing to sacrifice his own son. Because at the end of the day, he's a human being. He lost his wife, for goodness sakes, and he feels the enormity of the pain. So of course he cries. Yes, even Abraham cries. However, the Torah tells us a word where it says he cried, it's spelled with a small kaf. The letter Vilif Kotan, to cry over her, as one letter smaller than the rest, to emphasize the point that it was a controlled grief. It wasn't fair. It was Abraham being a human being and crying for the loss of his wife, but at the same time maintaining the balance of awareness of God and therefore not abandoning everything else in the process.
And were we perhaps not to quite be on the same level as Abraham, as Moses, if one of your members had come to you just a couple of weeks ago and had said, look, Rabbi, Pesach this year, I just can't do it. Perhaps I can't do it at all, or perhaps I can't do it at the regular level that I'm accustomed to doing. Practically, what would you say?
I would actually say, don't worry about it. We're all trying our best. It's not about how much you're doing. It's just that you're doing it in your own way. In God's world, when circumstances dictate the unexpected, he knows, he gets it, he appreciates your efforts, regardless of whether you did a full-on beautiful Pesach Seder or you sipped some wine, nibbled on some matzah, and lamented your inability to be with your family. Nothing has been more detrimental to the Jewish people as the modern idea that Judaism is a religion. If we're a religion, that some Jews are more Jewish, other Jews are less Jewish, and many Jews are arguably not Jewish at all. It's a fallacy. We are all one. If, God forbid, a Jew eats a ham sandwich or is on the golf course on Yom Kippur, it's as if we've all transgressed with him. When the same Jew stretches out his or her hand to give to a needy soul, to put on tefillin, or to light Shabbat candles, all of us stretch out our arms together. We're not a religion. We are a soul, a single entity, all united as one. Every Jew is valued. Every Jew counts, regardless the extent of your involvement in these circumstances. But I would say it's not how you identify, but that you identify. And that identity will ultimately be the catalyst that prompts you in your own way to be able to connect. And remember, ultimately, if God got you to it, he understands, and ultimately he'll get you through it.
Have you seen, Rabbi, any silver linings in a crisis such as this? Have you seen changes in engagement with your community? Have you seen any changes in volunteering?
Well, I think the response across the whole Anglo-Jewish community, and no doubt well beyond throughout the entire Jewish world, has been unbelievable. There's a story that came out today of a particular Judaic shop in Borough Park that said that anyone who had lost a spouse to COVID-19, they're arranging to cover their grocery bills from now until Rosh Hashanah. I mean, I know there was some criticism about rabbis failing miserably and not having allowed kitniyot for Pesach. To think that that is the be-all and end-all of people's problems this Pesach, and that somehow we would have been heroes if we would have allowed it, at best, that's being oblivious to the enormity of communal needs, being insensitive to the plight of so many people, whether they endured the loss of a loved one, whether they need food on their table and cannot get it, whether they simply need money, and countless other scenarios besides. Chesed, kindness, is a hallmark of the Jewish people. And the amount of chesed that I have seen across the community and beyond has been truly mind-boggling and inspiring. One small case in point: an elderly man calls my wife, who's in charge of welfare in the Millville community. He's home alone. He can't go out to do his laundry at the laundromat as he is wont to normally do. He has no more clean clothes. Can someone take his clothes to the laundry? Now, that in itself is a problem in the current virus. Connections are made. Within 24 hours, he has a washing machine delivered to his address and plumbed in. Problem solved. It's a snapshot of countless heroics that is going on everywhere. And all the online engagement has been amazing. All the different means by which suddenly people are connecting with their community, because I do believe that, notwithstanding the bigger question that we've been asking here from the outset, when we are in peril, Jewish people do dig deep, and they're looking for spiritual solace. And all of a sudden, instead of maybe 50 on a Friday night, and sure, you're getting 150 turning out for a Zoom Kabbalat Shabbat. Instead of the usual 150 that we get to a Yom HaShoah commemoration event in Millville Shul, we had over 500 zooming in the other night, etc. And we'll have the same next week for Yom HaZikaron. The whole ordeal is something that is bringing out, in so many ways, best in many different people. I know that ultimately, we're going to have to explore new ideas when this is all over, but no one has any idea about what's going to happen when this is all over. Sure, there's going to want to be a celebration on the one hand, but we have to be mindful of all the loss on the other. It's going to be a very interesting and tricky balance, but it is a big but. Will people also come back? There's going to be an overwhelming sense of trepidation. And one of those communities that are made up of largely older members who will certainly remain at home for far longer. So what troubles me more than anything is that there are so many unknowns. And I guess it's about just strategically planning for all and any eventuality. But incredibly, it has brought out such immense kindness, goodness from so many different people in so many wonderful ways.
I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience very shortly. We've got questions coming in from YouTube. I can see from Facebook and on email as well. Maybe just one more question from me now. This response then, this engagement in chesed, as you've put it, this engagement in community life, do you think even subconsciously this might be a response to God?
Yeah, I think that comes back to the earlier point. It's a case of people, like Elie Wiesel said, they're always consciously aware of it. They always know that they have to rise to the particular challenges at hand. And when I talk about Holocaust survivors, and you ask yourself always, how is it that they manage to pick themselves up and carry on? It's only because ultimately they believe in God, that they know that they don't give up, that they continue to persevere in the face of whatever the particular challenge. And yes, I think so many people are digging deep, not just because we are good human beings, but ultimately because we inherently know that this is the right thing to do. Or to put it differently, because I know this is what God wants me to do. This is why I'm here in the first instance.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start taking some questions now. This question comes in from Costa Roman on YouTube. Rabbi, if God made this happen, and there are some positives from it, she says, there's more time, there's less pollution, there's a greater appreciation of nature. What should we be learning from this experience?
What should we be learning from the experience? Is that the question?
What should we be learning from this experience?
Yes, it's true. It's more time, and it's true we've had more opportunity to spend time with our families. And my daughter asked me the other night, my 11-year-old, Dad, is it true that I'm adopted? And I looked at her and I said, not yet. I just took out the advert last night. But actually, what I've learned is that we have to be more patient. I've had 9 people in my home for a long period of time. That can be sometimes quite overwhelming, and you suddenly realize you don't have a choice. You're going to have to make this work. And in order to make this work, it's about simply working with everybody, being a little bit more patient with everybody, letting the little things go. So every one of us is going to ultimately take something out of this that they will hopefully nurture when we all get out of this, to be able to become a better person. Let me actually, if I may, within this, tell you a little anecdote of something that happened to me yesterday. People ask, will the world as we know it ever be the same? Yesterday, I was walking on my warm down for my daily exercise machine, and I actually saw a man sitting on a bus stop bench. His head was in his hands, and he was clearly distressed. He was dressed normally, but he was very distressed, and he looked very distraught, and I felt compelled to stop. And I asked him, are you okay? And he looked up at me and he said, well, I was laid off from work 3 weeks ago. I don't know where tomorrow's food is going to come from, for me, my wife, and our 2-year-old, but otherwise I'm fine. And I reached into my pocket. My wife always insists, no matter what, even if you're going out for exercise, take money with you. I had a 20-pound note, and I started to put it down. I offered it to him, and he gestured with his hand as though no, thank you. And I said to him, look, we're all in this together. There's no place for pride over here. I put the money down on the ground, and I smiled, and I said, you better grab it quickly, because anybody else over here, can someone come along? There was nobody within range, and we were at social distance. But I said, anyone else can come along over here and take this money if you don't hurry up. So he took it, and then he looked at me, and he actually said to me something very funny. He said, you're Jewish. I said, why? He said, because my ex-boss, as in the one who laid him off 3 weeks ago, is Jewish. Good to see some of you have soul, something like that. And I thought for a moment, and I said, look, I don't know the circumstances by which your boss had to leave you, give you leave of absence on the basis of everything that's going on at the moment. But I will tell you that you shouldn't go tarring a whole people with the same brush, no matter your issues with an individual. He smiled. He said, you're right, and thanks. I really appreciate your gesture. And off he went. And I suddenly thought to myself, 3 lessons. Number 1, would I have stopped for him under normal circumstances? Or has this pandemic fine-tuned us to be more aware of other people around us, more sensitive towards other people around us? And we should all introspect on that. Number 2, every encounter is deliberately orchestrated. Yes, by God, I believe. I don't know whether his boss had to lay him off or furlough him or whatever it is. What I do know is that our little interaction maybe took some of the sting out of an otherwise potential anti-Jewish perception. Will this pandemic foster more hate longer term, or will we learn to park our prejudices and be more tolerant of one another? Again, something to ponder. And finally, we're all preoccupied with keeping ourselves protected from the virus, but there is clearly something else sinister brewing out there, and you referenced that in your opening remarks very passionately. The financial impact on so many is taking its toll, and it's only going to get worse. Many thousands will emerge unscathed from infection, but will struggle to put food on their table. And that's something no isolation or quarantine can defend against. So will the world as we know it be the same? Many will emerge, I hope, with a new perspective on life, with a greater appreciation for the blessings even in the small stuff, and to be kinder and more sensitive towards other people. Many others will struggle because they have been personally impacted in devastating ways, whether through the tragic loss of a loved one or indeed because of the economic fallout. Either way, the world as we know it will not be the same, but if the former, that is those who have learned to become more sensitive, will be more attuned to the latter, recognizing that inasmuch as we are in this together, we must maintain that togetherness even when we get out of this, then it can yet become an overall better place.
Thank you. Our next question comes from John, and he actually wants to challenge the whole premise of our discussion, Rabbi Schochet. He says, my question would be, what has God got to do with COVID-19? Man has free will, things happen, disasters happen all the time. This is just a much greater one of giant proportions affecting everybody. Trying to put God into this type of disaster makes it all the more difficult to deal with and unnecessarily complicates it. What might you say to that?
I say I wholeheartedly agree to the fact that man has free will. The Egyptians had free will in that they opted in to go ahead and be the persecuting nation of the Jewish people. There's no question about that. And the Nazis had free will, and it was the Nazis, not God, who built the crematoriums and massacred 6 million Jewish people, etc., etc. I'm not sure where the free will comes in over here, unless you want to argue that, yes, okay, fine, it came through man generating the virus in whichever sort of way. But the bottom line remains in all those scenarios, God is God after all. And at some point, he can always step in to be able to put a halt on it. At some point, he can always step in to suddenly make the pandemic that came about suddenly disappear. Now, it's true, there was one great halachist and philosopher called Rabbi Nissim of Gerona, 14th century, who actually said that when it comes to nature, God doesn't typically interfere. By definition, God creates nature and then lets it pretty much run its course, other than, and I quote, if there is a great need. So therein lies the point. God can still intervene if there is a great need. And my goodness, for all that we know, everything going on right now, there is certainly an unbelievable need, begging the question, why isn't God now stepping in to put an end to it?
Next question comes in from a community rabbi. I'm not sure who it is. It says, Rabbi, I've been asked by many people about this Unity Sefer Torah that people are writing across the world. It has some work connected to COVID-19. Could you tell us about that, please?
There is a group of people that got together in New York at the onset of this virus, and we know that it has hit the New York community quite devastatingly as well. And they proceeded to write what they call a Unity Sefer Torah. There is precedent for this, and the significance of writing this Sefer Torah is in the way that it unites the Jewish people across the world. There is something compelling about the writing of the Sefer Torah. When we consider how the Second Temple was destroyed on account of the fact that there was a lack of unity, then we know that we have to redress the balance by generating unity amongst our Jewish community once more. And frankly, it's fair to say that we have been demonstrating greater unity over the last many, many, many years than long before. So now all of a sudden we find ourselves in a situation where we're, as much as we're not isolating one another, we're being forced into self-isolation instead on account of this virus. And a Sefer Torah is something unique in particular in the way that we are called B'nai Yisrael, the Jewish people, or Am Yisrael, the Jewish nation. The word Yisrael is an acronym for Yesh Kishim Ribu Osios LaTorah. There are 600,000 letters in a Sefer Torah. So by definition, there's a direct correlation between the Jewish people and the Torah scroll. In that, if one letter becomes cracked or erased, it affects the kosher status of a Sefer Torah. So too, if one Jew goes astray, it affects the totality of the Jewish people. It's not just his or her problem. It's our collective problem. And to that end, they started up this movement, or this campaign, I should call it, called Protection for Unity. And they have a website, protectionforunity.com, where everybody is encouraged to buy a letter in the Sefer Torah. It costs nothing, it costs $2 to buy a letter, or you can obtain the letter for free. You don't even have to pay for the letter if you don't want to. But the objective is to be able to have everybody obtain a letter in that Sefer Torah, and then the next Sefer Torah and the next Sefer Torah, because, and I say there's precedent for this, I believe in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, when there was a pandemic, and he encouraged that a Sefer Torah should be written, which in its own unique way unites Jewish people, everybody represented by a particular letter, every family member represented by another letter. And when we generate this compelling unity in that sort of way, especially in light of the otherwise challenging situation in which we are separated from one another, then that can only but help to enhance some broader collective spiritual dynamic that will benefit the totality of the Jewish people and indeed every single individual.
Let me stick with YouTube and ask another question, and then I'll come back to some questions from Facebook. Next question, Rabbi, comes from Leo Davis. Rabbi, is Hashem involved in the human race at a level of detail that he might solve coronavirus or disaster? Or is he perhaps a big picture type that's given us the tools we need to do our best?
When Moses challenged God in watching the Jewish people endure the suffering in Egypt, and he said, "Why are you allowing evil to befall your people?" Many commentaries suggest that was a certain lack of faith in Moses in that moment, daring to question God. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually points out that actually that's faith of the highest order, because it illustrates the fact that Moses believes that God is involved in all of the intricate detail of every single aspect of the human race. Indeed, the first of the 10 commandments is very deliberately written in singular form. It says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your God, Elokecha, your, singular, instead of Elokechem, plural. Because God, fundamental to Jewish belief, is that God is a personal God to every single one of us, is aware of everything that goes on in every single one of our personal lives, as it were, and therefore is also equally involved in everything that goes on in our personal lives. One of the famous lines that we refer to taken from the Tanakh is, B'chol tzaratam lo tsar. In all of their pains, he too has pain. We can't quite fathom exactly what that means, but in as much as when we are in pain, God feels that pain no less. In fact, note how when we say Kaddish, people say Kaddish for the loss of a loved one. And there's no reference in that Kaddish whatsoever to a loved one in any way, shape, or form, to death, to mourning, to loss. All we talk about is exalting God. Why? What's that got to do with my personal loss? And the answer suggested in Jewish mysticism is that when a person is taken from this world, a so-called piece of God, a piece of divinity, goes missing, as it were, as well. And through the Kaddish and exalting God, we restore that element within godliness, and that gives God comfort, and that in turn gives the loved one comfort as well. So yes, in answer to the question more specifically, God is very much involved in the human race. Now, is God just throwing stuff at us just to test our resolve? God's not a personal coach. He doesn't just drop us into the field with a pair of boxing gloves and say, okay, let's see how much you can, how long you can punch the bag, or how many miles you can run. For what purpose? Everything is done with very specific, deliberate intent. And therefore, on that basis, whatever's happening is not happening because I just want to test my endurance. It's happening for a reason. Again, albeit a reason that is well beyond my comprehension. And because it's beyond my comprehension, as I said earlier, well, God, I don't get it. So if I don't get it, you give it to me. You explain it to me. And if you don't explain it to me, take it away from me.
You refer to Kaddish Rabbi, and I've received what can only be described as a passive-aggressive question on YouTube, as someone calling themselves head teacher. Rabbi, can we talk about the decision not to be able to say Kaddish on Zoom? Perhaps, Rabbi, you could just actually elucidate what that question is before giving us your thoughts.
I guess the question is whether, well, the question is very precise. We can have a minyan on Zoom. So we have 10 people, or 10 men more precisely. And in the same way that we have a community that has 10 men in it gathered in a shul when we want to go ahead and pray. And at that moment in time, at the various intervals during the actual prayer service, we can go ahead and say the Kaddish. So now we don't have access to our shuls. And on the basis that we don't have access to our shuls, we therefore have virtual services. And the question, of course, is, well, in those virtual services, can we then not actually say Kaddish? And the answer is this. Let's consider the following analogy. You have 10 men who get together with bricks and cement, and they go ahead and they start constructing a building. That works. Now, for whatever the reason, these 10 men are in their own individual homes and lock up. Each one has their own brick. Each one has their own pile of cement. They can't combine their bricks and their cement in order to be able to construct whatever they were looking to build before, because virtual reality doesn't compensate for physical reality. Now let us consider the background to Kaddish. The temple existed once upon a time, and there wasn't a structured prayer service per se at that point. When the temple, or towards the end of the temple era, when the temple was destroyed, the 120 great men of the Great Assembly came together, lofty men of great spiritual stature, and they constructed the prayer service as we know it. And within that, they also introduced certain specific prayers that they insisted require a minyan of 10 a physical presence of 10 men in close proximity to each other, which in turn generates a unique kind of spiritual energy that enables certain prayers to be able to be recited. And when there aren't 10, and there's only 9, or there's only 8, or there's only 7, or whatever it is, then you can't recite those particular prayers because you're not generating that same spiritual energy. And in the same way as it works in the physical reality, it's the way it works in the spiritual reality. By definition, now that 10 men are sitting separately and not together in their physical proximity, each in their own home, the virtual reality does not compensate for a physical reality. Whilst I appreciate that one may want to say Kaddish, and no one knows it more than someone who's endured a loved one, the loss of a loved one, and how much more so for those who may have endured the loss of a loved one, particularly in this time, so they didn't even have an opportunity yet to say proper Kaddish. I appreciate the emotion involved. And when one wants to say Kaddish, or maybe one wants to say Kaddish with a virtual minyan, it might provide personal emotional solace and maybe does something for you. But what Kaddish is ultimately intended, as we said before, is to give elevation to the neshama, to the soul of the loved one. And that can only be achieved when adhering to the precise formula that the great spiritual men who introduced the Kaddish defined as the formula by which it is meant to work. So in other words, if we can't generate that spiritual energy, the Kaddish might work to give you some personal emotional solace, but it isn't going to work for the benefit of your soul, of the soul of the loved one. And ultimately, Kaddish is indeed about the loved one more so than it is about oneself. That isn't to say, however, that there cannot be alternatives. And for example, in our virtual minyan every single morning, when we get to that interval where Kaddish would normally be recited, I encourage at that point in time what I call Kaddish meditation, where those mourners who would otherwise be saying Kaddish go quiet for a full minute or so, and the rest of us maintain a dignified silence, and they think about their loved one. And I know that that is uniquely impacting on them in that precise moment in time. Moreover, one of the things our rabbis tell us is the opportunity to learn Mishnah. Mishnah has the same Hebrew letters as the word neshama, meaning soul. And by definition, you can learn Mishnah in order to give elevation to the soul. And each morning after my service, and again each evening at 7:30 on Facebook Live, we tend to learn a Mishnah, and we read out all the names of all the people who would otherwise have Kaddish said for them, and that Mishnah therefore is being learned for them. And here's the real point. I believe this fundamentally. When we are in a situation where we are not able to do the things that we were able to do before, it's not that we're being denied the opportunity to do so. It's that right now, we're not obligated to do so. And there are other things that we can and are meant to do which will achieve that same sort of objective. One young man called me up distraught 2 weeks ago. My mother was a member of the Chevra Kadisha in her hometown for 15 years. She provided the tahara, the purification process, prior to when somebody is being laid to rest. And now she has passed away from the virus, and she's being denied this opportunity to have this same purification process. And I said to him, Simon, she's not being denied the opportunity to have that process. The fact that she can't have it means that she doesn't need to have it. There's something special about your mother's soul that she doesn't need to have that tahara, that unique purification process. And I say the same applies to all the others that have since found themselves in that same sort of situation. Similarly, with regard to Kaddish, again, you need to have the minyan, the 10 men gathered physically in close proximity to generate the right kind of spiritual energy in order for the Kaddish to do what it needs to do to give elevation to the soul. That's the formula. That's the reality. Without that, it just simply doesn't achieve what it is meant to do. But we have the other options. And those other options at this point in time will achieve absolutely that same objective.
Let me turn now to Facebook. A question from Eleanor Mandelstam. Rabbi, we've already touched on some of the good works that the communities are doing, and yourself in particular. But what more as a community can we do for people in need during coronavirus, particularly those who have suffered bereavement or mental ill health?
At this point in time, I think every community has its own rabbi and welfare team who are digging really deep and coming up with all different kinds of creative and novel ideas. And every community is different insofar as what it can do. one of the things that we've done, and every community can actually do this, is we had an amazing team of volunteers that made a point of making phone calls to every member over the age of 80, which are quite a few, and asking them if they had any particular needs and if they needed any particular shopping, etc. And then a gap to about a week or so, and then did the same thing to everybody over the age of 70. Even tonight, just before we went online, I noticed somebody went on the Mill Hill Shul Facebook page and said that they were they now quarantined because one of the family members are showing signs because somebody pick up chalot for them tomorrow for Shabbat. And immediately there is a response, reaching out, just calling the individual members of the community in whichever sort of way, letting them know that you're thinking of them and making sure to ask if they have any requirements, if they have any needs, and being able to address that accordingly goes a long way. In addition to which, I mean, even the Project Chesed at the United Synagogue is doing an unbelievable job. And the way they're coordinating things behind the scenes. Again, just yesterday, Project Chesed called my wife. There was a woman who lives in Edgware, picks up her medication from Mill Hill. She's 91 years old. She's in her house alone. Can someone get the medication for her and drop it at her home? And it was done. And it was organized immediately and accordingly as such. The mental illness fallout is something that I think is, by and large, being considerably overlooked, and it is very real, and it is of great concern. And I think that Jamie is there. I don't think that enough people are aware of Jamie and whichever other organizations are on hand to be able to help and to be able to address those sort of problems as well. But we are privileged in the Jewish community to have Jamie as one particular example that deals with mental health. And if one is aware of themselves or a family member or somebody else struggling with mental health in this particular crisis, then they should encourage them, or on their behalf, with their permission, contact Jamie, make that link up, because that certainly needs to be addressed. And I think a lot of that is going to need to be addressed all the more so after we come out as well.
Thank you. Our time has absolutely flown by. Thank you, Rabbi Schochet. So we've got time for one more question from our viewers before I ask you one final question of my own. This question comes from Stephen Richter. The question is, Rabbi, do you think this epidemic has created a humanity reset?
I think that goes back to my earlier point about, will the world be the same again? There's a story of the Rabbi of Klosenberg, the Klosenberger Rebbe, as he was known. Klosenberger Rebbe was a phenomenal human being. He is the one who, after the war, went to build the Laniado Hospital in Israel. During the war, he lost his family, his wife and 11 children. When the war ended, he sat there and he cried bitterly. People asked him, "Why are you crying? I mean, you were so strong and forthright throughout, and yet now you are crying." And he explained, and he said, "I was certain that with all that which we were enduring, that Mashiach was certainly going to become, the Mashiach was certainly going to be on his way. And here the war is over, and we are where we left off before." And in that sense, therefore, he was lamenting the fact that something didn't actually change in the broader dynamic of civilization. But against that, something did fundamentally change as well. In our Slichot service between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, before Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur itself, we make reference to three unique individuals, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We talk about the fact that God, who answered them, should answer us as well. Who were they? They lived in the time of Daniel, the prophet, and they were exiled to Babylon. And when Jews were being made to submit to idolatry, they refused. And so they were thrown into a furnace. And there's a whole discussion about what happened. And of course, they emerged unscathed. The story is told in the actual book of Daniel. And ultimately, the king let them go. That's it. You find the fact that the king, the Nebuchadnezzar, saw them walking along in the furnace unscathed. A miracle was performed for them. And he said, "Come on out." End of story. Talmud asks the question, what happened to them? And one of the suggestions of the Talmud is they went up to Israel, they got married, they had children. And the Talmud makes the statement as though it's a novelty, something unique. It's a chiddush, as we call it. Because you'd think that as an account of what they had endured, they'd be traumatized. It would impact their life and they wouldn't be able to pick themselves up and move on. And yet the Talmud says, you know what, they did pick themselves up. They went back up to Israel, they got married, they had children. When we think about the Holocaust, you'd think that with 900,000 or whatever it is survivors, they too would be so fundamentally traumatized they would give up. That was in the Nuremberg trials. That was part of the actual testimony, that it was safely assumed on account of all the enormity of the loss, everybody else would just give up on their faith. And yet what happened? People picked themselves up, went to Israel, rebuilt from the ashes, built the ground, built the land once more, and built on from there. Went on, had children, etc., etc., etc. Built Jewish life as it is thriving once more. So each of us has to introspect in light of what we are enduring right now. And every time the world goes through some mammoth event, it does create a certain kind of reset. Some may just come out of this, like the Klausenberger Rebbe lamented, no different than before, and that in itself will be a tragedy of its own. Most of us, I'd like to think, will emerge from this suddenly appreciating the frailty of life, the beauty of life, the enormity of our responsibility in life, the gift of life, and therefore maybe look to make that much more of a difference towards one another and make the world a better place.
And my final question, Rabbi, if I may, is about yourself. You've had to spend the many weeks, now last few months even, helping your members make sense of what's going on around them, helping them learn new things about themselves in response to this crisis. What have you learned about yourself in this period?
Well, I suppose if nothing else, like I mentioned before, in being around my family that much more, I realize how I become so utterly submerged often enough in my community work that it is somewhat to the detriment of my own family, and having the opportunity to spend that much more time with my children, or the fact that I may be working from home and so can therefore engage with them because they're also at home on a regular basis, suddenly makes me marvel at how much more I need, it makes me reflect on the fact that I've been missing out maybe a lot in the way that I should be spending more time with them, and how much more I have to spend time with them. It's also made me dig deep in my own self to reflect on the need to be that much more in tune to people out there, because we take so much for granted in our day-to-day interactions. This scenario makes us all focus that much more on just a basic human interaction. 5 minutes before we started here, we all went out on the street, we all started to clap for the NHS, and everyone's just smiling because you suddenly see your neighbors. Neighbors who you otherwise might not even look the other way towards when you might pass them in the street. And there's one particular neighbor just several weeks ago, he lives actually about a block away, and he's a peculiar person, and people look at him as such, and people don't consider him too child-friendly, etc. And he was walking past a couple of weeks ago, and he was across the street, and he was wearing a mask, and I was standing outside my own house, and I was wearing a mask, and I saw him, and I said, hello. Guess what? He answered hello. And I said, how are you? And he said, I'm good. How are you? The next thing you know, for 25 minutes, we're having a conversation where I come to discover that he's an astronomer, that he was pointing out to me the fact that there was the International Space Station that was passing overhead at 7 o'clock that night. I mean, who knew, etc., etc. And guess what? He's also Jewish. And all of a sudden, on account of all of this, you're realizing that there are people that you might otherwise not give a passing glance towards, like the guy on the bus park bench yesterday, that we need to learn to just start stopping, pausing, talking to, etc. And above all else, more than anything, I've come to learn to change the things that I can in the circumstances, to accept the things that I can't in the circumstances, and to have the wisdom to know the difference between the two.
Rabbi, thank you. We reached the end of our time. It's an absolute pleasure being in conversation with you, and I can see by the hundreds of people who are watching across the various social media platforms, this has been a very popular enterprise. Perhaps we will come together again at some point in the future as well for another conversation. Rabbi Schochet, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good luck and stay safe.